Daniel Kaufmann combines influential civil society work with substantial academic contributions. He is president of the NRGI, which has galvanized the resource governance knowledge over the last 2 decades. Daniel, welcome to Raw Talks.
Thank you.
Resource governance refers to multiple considerations such as accountability, transparency, revenue management, so on. Is it fair to say that resource-rich nations have weaker governance than the rest?
Unfortunately, it's very fair to say that resource-rich countries have weaker governance than the rest. That's true on average, and it's also true that their governance quality, in fact, deteriorated a bit over the past 15 years, even during the times of the boom, while the rest of the world improve. But that's on average. There's still a number of countries which are resource-rich that are showing that improvements are feasible.
But now we're talking about weaker or stronger governance. This means that you think that that could be measured. How do you measure governance?
With a lot of hard work and using basically, literally, and that's what we do, hundreds of thousands of data points that are collected painstakingly by the views of experts, by the views of citizens in terms of surveys that are tailor-made for this effect, and as well as the views of firms, the corporate sector, which is very important in this context. 15 years ago, the whole notion of governance was very much outside of economics, very much outside of anything that could be considered measurable. And it was subject to very long narratives and prose. We challenged that, and we showed that it can be measured. And if one cannot measure it, it cannot be, you cannot do much about it. It cannot be controlled. So it's eminently measurable, but with caution, and with caution interpretation, because no measure is perfect.
So which countries rank highest and lowest?
It depends also what exactly one is measuring. First, we have a set of measures about governance broadly constituted, and what I was discussing before. We also measure the countries how they rate best and worst and in the middle in terms of resource governance, how they're managing the extractive in the more resource-rich countries. And there again, countries like Norway do well, but countries like Chile, my own country, do extremely well, and a number of Latin American countries are showing to many others that yes, it can be done, and again, you don't have to be rich. Countries like Colombia and Peru are making a lot of inroads too. So it's very important to focus on the exciting things that are happening in the emerging world, with some examples showing others that it can be done, while countries like the United States, the challenges are only growing.
Is the problem down to dysfunctional governments, or do natural resources give rise to exceptional challenges?
Resource richness gives basically rise to particular challenges that in some cases can be exceptional, and it has been labeled as a resource curse by some. And that's because we're talking about what's called the black gold, the most valuable physical resource in the world that is easily amenable to capture by elite, by special interests, political or corporate, as well as insurgent groups. You couple that with the absence of an incentive to create a domestic tax base and other resource mobilization, and to give incentive for other type of productivity in the population with in the non-resource sectors, then the country has much more significant challenges.
Let's address the phenomenon of corruption more in detail. I know that you have studied it quite a lot. When considering variables influencing long-term growth, we talk often about investment, education, trade, etc. But how important is corruption in that thinking?
If we were talking about data, I'll give you one data point on that. 300%. And then you're going to ask me, what do you mean 300%?
What do you mean 300%?
300%. With my co-author at the time at the World Bank at Cray, we found that on average, if you take all the countries in the world and historically, a country that improves in governance, say controlling corruption, improve rule of law, better voice and democratic accountability, better regulatory equality, in the long term, takes a long time to get the fruits, it increases its per capita income by 3 times. And that's what we call the 300% development dividend of good governance, or of controlling corruption.
It can be quite a controversial statement, but some do claim that corruption can be seen as a redistribution mechanism. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I would agree, but not with those that claim it. It is a redistribution, but in the vast majority of the case, it's a redistribution to the top political and economic elite. So in fact, and there are serious studies in that direction, that the more corruption, the more inequality grows. And this is because of what we just explained regarding this black gold. It's a capture by the elites. Sometimes it's a political elite, sometimes it's a kleptocrat, the leader of the country, but sometimes are the oligarchs, the corporate elite. So the redistribution definitely happens, but in the negative direction.
You've said that you don't fight corruption by fighting corruption. How do you fight it then?
I have said that. I'm not going to deny it. And the reason I've said that is because in the earlier days, and even now, in learning and working in this area, it's been always the toughest thing, what constitutes success. It was easier to find out what leads to failure or what doesn't work. And what we learned that doesn't work is fighting corruption by fighting corruption. Namely, is a corruption scandal, what does a country do? It adopts another anti-corruption law when it has already plenty but are not enforced. What else? They create another anti-corruption commission, which becomes captured part of the same problem than the others, with a few exceptions, like in Hong Kong, Singapore, maybe Indonesia. But other than that, they are part of the problem, their solution. Or another anti-corruption campaign is launched by the leader. Russia is already in the 25th anti-corruption campaign. That hasn't worked, obviously. China sometimes falls into that trap as well. Instead, what is needed is to look at the whole governance and institutional system, and in every country will be different. What are the major failings that are the cause, the root cause of that corruption? Is it that there is absolute impunity and no rule of law? Is it that there is no voice for the citizenry to make them accountable and so on? And that's why one has to look at these other factors.
Let's move on and look at civil society as a stakeholder in these directives. Over the past 20 years, civil society organizations, they have been very influential in shaping the policy agenda. What led to the emergence of these organizations? Is it down to failing governments?
It's a combination of things, as usual. And particularly in the case of the extractives, there was, with the advent of a bit more transparency and investigative reporting, it became very clear in the extractives that there were major abuses, including of human rights, where companies were also involved, like some companies, particularly in Africa. And we're talking about the 1990s. And that already by some NGOs, like Global Witness, at the time, they began to issue expose and report. And all of that was taking place under a cloud of opacity, where the companies and the governments would not disclose anything of what was going on with these billions of dollars of this black gold, which is related to oil, but also to mining. So that led to initiatives like the emphasis and the demand, and that was at the time in Angola, that you have to disclose what you're paying to the government, so that to make them accountable, rather than going to the coffer or a bank in Switzerland for the leader. And that created that whole coalition of NGO publishers you pay, which was then the route for an international collective action initiative regarding transparency in natural resources, which is the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, or EITI. That's in terms of the sector. But more broadly, what was happening also at the same time in the 1990s is that there was increasing recognition that governments, even well-meaning governments, but just adopting laws and regulations was insufficient for them to be implemented on the ground. And you needed more mechanism for accountability of that. So some of the reformers, even in government, started to even welcome activists from outside, and even some very forward-thinking people in the private sector to engage more in reforms. And that led also to more activism and the good work that many NGOs, think tanks, academics, and outsiders have been doing.
And do civil society truly represent people? Can people hold the civil society accountable for what they're doing?
If we mean basically in a very, very broad sense, not only the traditional NGOs, and certainly not just the international NGOs, but the local NGOs, the local civil society groups, trade unions, but also the ones representing different ethnic groups and in the regions, then we start talking about real representation. The problem becomes when the participation is extremely elite, it's only in the capital, and there are some initiatives that only welcome a very, very particular elite group of NGOs, and that's not representative.
For a long time, civil society has been associated with outright opposition to the extractive industries and to corporations. I don't think that is necessarily the case anymore. Many organizations, they have taken a seat at the table to engage in the policy discussions. What changed?
Yeah, and you're right. There has been a movement towards change in that context because of the realization that progress can be made by forming coalitions of those that are prepared to look into transparency, reforms, and better management in resources in all stakeholders. There are enlightened governments, and even if I'm in civil society and NGOs, there are clearly some very enlightened governments and leaders and people who work there. The same can be said about companies. One cannot fully generalize. And in fact, it's very divided. Within governments, you have reformers and non-reformers. Within companies and industries, you have the big oil companies in the United States that are still protecting opacity, Exxon, Chevron, and so on, while others, and particularly in the mining sector, are moving on, and they're very much for reform. So from a civil society perspective, to be able to engage with the reformers in the other stakeholders is something that has been found to be productive, while at the same time speaking truth to power about those that are not basically subscribing to reform, to protecting the environment, and to do better regarding extractive governance.
And let's talk more about industry. Is governance ultimately down to governments? What role do companies play in governance?
Governance is about the rules of the game and all the institutions that basically govern how authority in a country is exercised, is monitored, is replaced. So it basically involves all of us. It involves the government, definitely, but also the private sector as well as the citizenry. And the relationship between those three is absolutely key. And that's part of good governance. That's why one has to distinguish between good governance, which is much broader, from the narrow sense of just good government. And that has been one of the movements over the past 20 years, is not to think just that the government is the only key actor in this. So it's absolutely key for governance is the interaction between the three. And of course, the government plays an absolutely key role in setting some of these rules of the game, and particularly in terms of the regulatory and legal framework, as well as in the provision of basic public service to the population. But then the way it enables or disables the environment for civil society to operate, for industry to thrive, and so on, is absolutely key.
Good governance has been central to the resource policy agenda, and it's nearly 2 decades, but efforts were put to the test during the boom and quite varied results. Looking back, in your view, has there been sufficient progress?
A flat no. Progress not only was insufficient, in many cases was absent, and on average, resource-rich countries went slightly backwards.
What went wrong?
While the rest of the world went forward. Well, part of the problem of being very resource-rich is exactly that issue we discussed at the beginning, is the incentives become perverse. Those become that much more perverse at the times of the boom, when a logic would dictate for the future and for our kids, let's use these funds to invest for the future of our kids, more education, more health, more in the institutions. Let's save in a very reasonable way for the future. If Venezuela would have just put 10% into savings during the boom time, they would have $90 billion now. They're bankrupt. The country it's up in flames. But instead, the incentive, the political incentive, particularly for non-enlightened leaders and the political elite and the corporate elite, is to try to appropriate those funds. And obviously, they say, why should we reform now? We're in a bonanza, we're doing very well. And anybody who tries to oppose or bring sanity into that, they can be bought off. And that's what many of these rulers do during boom times. They can distribute some funds to maintain that peace. It's very sobering to look very carefully what happened. At the same time, where you had enlightened leadership, the countries did take the opportunity and things went very well, and you saw a lot of progress. In Latin America, which is my region, for instance, it's very, very telling to look, on the one hand, what happened in countries like Chile, Peru, Colombia, and all the progress made in terms of development with what happened in Venezuela. And also, let me say it very bluntly, Brazil. And it happened. So you have those distinctions. So again, let's not generalize. Some countries did take that opportunity. In Africa, the Botswanas of this world did well, but then Ghana basically wasted that boom and got into a huge macroeconomic crisis. They had to call basically the firefighter international organization, which is the IMF, and that's what it was. So there are very sobering lessons from the boom years. And in fact, maybe a real opportunity now, because now we're at the lower prices and countries under stress. Now it's the time to reform. Now it's a real opportunity because there's no choice.
Daniel, thank you very much for joining Raw Talks.
Thank you very much, Osa.
And to keep up with the new debate on extractives and development, join us at rawtalks.org.